Damn, Tyranids, you so crazy. Greetings, grimdark enjoyers. I figured I'd continue this current arc on the channel where I analyze the design and characterization failings with various factions in 10th edition Warhammer 40k. This time my focus turns to a Xenos faction which I'm rather fond of, the Tyranids. Yes, it turns out that the antagonist stars of 10th edition have a terrible army rule and a characterization I would say is mid at best. This one has been a long time coming. It seems GW just doesn't understand the space bugs from outer space. Welcome to the terrible characterization of 10th edition Tyranids. What is an army rule? Now, for the sake of clarity, I think I should start with what an army rule is. If you are someone who understands what army rules are in Warhammer 40k, and the contextual purpose they serve, feel free to jump ahead. When playing Warhammer 40k on the tabletop, your army is tied to a faction. Those factions are characterized with a broad overarching rule, which in 10th edition is called an army rule. These army rules typically affect every unit in your army, and serve two important functions. It's responsible for characterizing the narrative themes of your faction, and for giving your army a unique gameplay hook relative to other factions. Necrons are a good example. For those unfamiliar, Necrons are space undead. The narrative situates the Necrons as legions of inexorable, soulless warriors seeking to reconquer the galaxy. They are beings made of necrodermis, a sci-fi alloy, which, to put simply, is especially tough and has unique regenerative properties. On the tabletop, the Necrons' army rule is reanimation protocols, which allow them to regain lost wounds and reinforce slain models back into their units. Remember, army rules apply broadly, so this characterizes the Necrons' faction as one which is dauntless in their efforts, literally pulling themselves back together after death. Very fitting for Space Undead. It gives them a unique characterizing hook and is a good example of rules design which abstracts the narrative at play. For what it's worth, to get a better gauge of my design standards on army rules, here are a couple more. The Orcs' Wa army rule is just top-shelf stuff, excellent in its crude simplicity, and yet undeniably impactful, very befitting of the Greenskins. And a mostly great army rule is the Chaos Space Marines' Dark Pacts. Having those who are slaves to darkness make pleas to dark gods, which result in either boons or scorn, is again a strong design choice as it relates to rules abstracting the narrative for gameplay on the tabletop. The only gap here is that theme only works best for traitor legions and renegade warbands who want to be tight with the chaos gods. And as for a bad example, to start, let's get right in with the army rule. I feel at this point it isn't at all controversial to claim that the Tyranids' army rules are... oh, what word would be best to describe it? Oh, I know. Ass. The rules are ass. It's sort of become a trend in Warhammer 40k that if your codex is among the first few of a new edition, your rules will inevitably become subpar. This is because, or at least in part, that GW's 3-year edition cycle is too quick for even the designers to account and plan for. And those first codices, like the Tyranids in 10th edition, do not yet know the climate that the edition will bear out. Though the exception to this is the Space Marines codexes, because while they do debut at the start of an edition, because of the above average unit and rule support they receive over that edition's run, they tend to keep parity fairly well. And the reality is that GW isn't really looking to have a persistent ecosystem, where a faction's rules can just be settled, or where the initial codices of an edition can establish the norm. And so having a pre-planned, thought-through potency of where rules should operate doesn't serve them. It's just better, and easier, to shrug and say, we couldn't really perceive the potency or lack thereof for these new rules we've designed, and so here's an errata. Gotta shake up that meta, after all. And when we consider that this rules management paradigm we find ourselves in all feeds into GW's intended business model, it all begins to feel rather gross. All of that is to say, the Tyranids' army rules are poor, referring to both Synapse and Shadaow In The Warp. And so I'll be going through them one at a time, starting with Synapse. The flavor text here stipulates, some Tyranids serve as synaptic conduits or nodal relays through which a portion of the Hive Mind's iron will flows, overriding the natural instincts of the swarm to direct the teeming warrior beasts to function as a single, gestalt organism on the battlefield. This army rule applies to the typical Synapse creatures within the swarm, giving those units an aura of influence. While within that aura, all units can roll 3d6 battle shock tests instead of the usual 2d6. And those units gain +1 strength in melee as well, which wasn't something present during the publication's release, but was facked in as an effort to keep up with either runaway rules creep or half-cooked rules at the time. Regardless, this is Synapse in 10th edition. Let's assess. For starters, I think we can say that the aim of maintaining Synapse as an aura keyed off of the appropriate Synapse creatures is the right one, as Synapse literally is an aura of influence and control. Most commonly in past editions, it would allow units to simply auto-pass morale tests, and while I understand the desire to structure the rule in 10th edition to still leave room for Tyranids to fail battle shock tests, it renders the ability pretty milquetoast in comparison to other army rules out there. The second perk of +1 strength isn't bad as it relates to its sheer mechanical value, as +1 strength does a lot for various melee profiles, as it enables the reaching of wound roll breakpoints. But it's a pretty weak thematic abstraction for what the rule is trying to narratively convey. Synapse should be about control. And while one could make the argument that, well, when the bugs are in Synapse range, they're just better able to focus their muscles. Really, that is just spin. My preference is always going to bias in favor of abstracting narrative with the most suitable mechanics available, as it yields a thematically richer tabletop experience with a better game feel. Moving on to Shadaow In The Warp. Again, let's start with the flavor text 10th edition provides. Tyranids flood the battlefield with the psychic signature of the Hive Fleet, an icy alien dread that gnaws at the minds of their prey, and smothers even the most stalwart courage. When faced with such unfathomable horror, many are driven insane or suffer catastrophic neural damage. I'll just say it, this iteration we have here of Shadaow In The Warp is terrible. A once per battle forced battle shock test for every enemy unit on the battlefield, sure, it sounds good at first glance, but it's just too random to provide strategic value, even after including the post-publication fact -1 modifier. I'll explain. Yes, when units fall to battle shock, it can deny those units scoring and the lack of stratagems, and make falling back a little bit more consequential. But that value is predicated on the randomness of passing a 2d6 dice roll for standard battle shock tests, which sure is swingy, but even after factoring the Neurotyrant's -1 bonus, and even including the additional fact -1 bonus when near a Synapse creature, sure, luck is less of an issue. Under that framing, yeah, it is likely some enemy units will suffer battle shock if I'm imposing a battle shock test against all enemy units on the battlefield. However, there is a but. Because I'm not choosing what fails, I still need the right units to fail those tests.
Meaning,
if the enemy army has, say, 3 units in position to push for objectives, and another primed to use a potent stratagem, those are the only ones I care to battle shock. And if those units happen to pass their tests, because it is all random after all, but some random units on the flanks or in the enemy backfield are the only units which fail my imposed battle shock tests, then Shadaow In The Warp virtually does nothing for me. And that's even before considering if my opponent doesn't use the Insane Bravery stratagem to auto-pass battle shock tests, or any other similar abilities. What we have here is just a grade A example of a terrible design choice. Remember that army rules are what is responsible for characterizing factions, and so as a rule of thumb, they should never fail to yield value, as that characterizes a faction as feckless. All the more so if it's a once per battle perk. And there is something more to say about how this feckless once per battle army rule interacts with the Chaos Demon's Shadow of Chaos army rule. which actually might take the cake for the most narratively jarring, ludonarratively dissonant rules interaction in the game, where the Shadaow In The Warp often ends up just bolstering the demonic legion. It's woefully unthematic, mechanically disappointing, and quite pathetic, really. In summary, that covers the issues with the Tyranids army rules. It's a bit of an opposite issue compared to the Sisters of Battle, where their army rule is mechanically potent but thematically ill-fit. Synapse's benefits are fairly mid. Shadaow In The Warp is too limited, requiring circumstantial dice tests to fail the one time you're able to use it. And so I think you'll agree the design work here and faction characterization is rather poor for the Tyranids. Now, as per usual, I do have some fixes, but we'll save those for later and stick to the issues for now. Moving on to units. Honestly, I pretty much like all of the new units added in the 10th edition Leviathan range refresh. I dig many of the new units, like the Leapers and Psychophage, though the Biovore is basically a complete reimagining, but it's one I would say gains more than it loses. I guess the one point I'm most let down by is that I wish the Norns were a couple weight classes larger, but I wouldn't frame those as design characterization failings, more so just my preferences. But on the rules front, I do find a pretty severe lack of characterization. Squandered design space, if you will. The issue? The most alien faction doesn't quite feel alien enough. There are a couple of winners or exceptions in this area, though. The Biovore being able to fire living artillery and thus spawn new interactable units is a very unique and very alien flex, though 10th edition's competitive tournament bias with regards to rules design has gimped the mechanic at its knees. The alien feel is there, it's just clamped, much like the fun it could yield. Another sweet spot is the Parasite of Mortrex, which is better off. It's able to spawn Ripper Swarms if it kills an infantry model with its extra implant attack. Very alien, obviously. Those are perhaps the best examples, or at least my favorites. But the area which most players, or hell, even onlookers, will level the poor characterization claim towards Tyranids is around the idea that the most alien faction is one which opts to hold guns in the same way humans do. And while I don't love the design choice, for better or for worse, this is the lay of the land. GW has made their bed, and this is the Tyranids' aesthetic and design direction. And assuming we must work within this constraint, I believe the best possible way to compensate for this is to make the Tyranids' firearms, their weapon symbiotes, feel alien. Personally, I love the idea of weapon symbiotes in principle, but they don't have any mechanics which characterize or communicate their unique nature. For example, am I supposed to believe that the Tyranids' Devourer is doing the same thing as an Orc Shuda? Like, really? Really? I mean, with rules like this, I'm definitely feeling that alien flavor. My point is, GW has failed to characterize the weapon symbiotes of the Tyranids. Quite a shame, as it's one of the most unique design points of the faction. A real wasted design opportunity if there was one. Which, as you would imagine, contributes to the presently weaker characterization we find for the Tyranids in 10th edition. And I guess that brings us to the suggestions/fixes section of the video, starting with weapons. Weapon fixes. Tyranid weapon symbiotes ought to have abilities. They should be characterized and given an identity through the use of game mechanics and relative comparison to the Imperial standard. Funnily enough, the Necrons again serve as a good example, with their Gauss weapons consistently applied with lethal hits, and their Tesla weapons having sustained hits. In this way, Gauss technology is characterized as being naturally deadlier, as it strips away matter layer by layer. And Tesla weapons, with its ability to cause lightning arcs all over the target unit, is well abstracted by the use of a mechanic like sustained hits. You see, this is a good example of using abilities to characterize weapon standards, rather than using these mechanics to dole out wombo-combo potency boosters at a player's whim, which I think is demonstrably a better use of that design space, but that's a discussion for a different video. Now, following this line of reasoning, since the Tyranids' weapon symbiotes are even more bizarre and horrific compared to that of the Necrons, I think they are deserving for unique, aberrant abilities. They should be deviant and unnatural. Now, principally, this breaks the intended use of universal weapon abilities. However, if universal weapon abilities are intended to serve as a standard to which commonly understood weapons operate, it seems to me like ripe design space for the most alien weapons to subvert that common understanding. Stick with me on this, guys. I feel like it's so good. And it's right there. You can imagine the uninitiated looking over various faction rules, looking at bolt guns, power weapons, Votan weapons, Tau pulse technology, and even Eldar and Necron's weapon technology, all falling within the commonly understood functionality of weapon abilities. Sure, they may be more advanced or more deadly, but you can look at it and understand it. A sci-fi gun is a sci-fi gun. And then you get to the Tyranids, and you're like, what the hell is this? And this is my point. Tyranid weapon symbiotes should feel like vile abominations, and they should be characterized to communicate that. And I think it's worthy of this exception. Here are a few examples I threw together to serve as a characterization standard. I'll try to be brief. Let's start with the Flesh Borer, as it's a good baseline and we can use the existing profile. Now, the Flesh Borer, commonly used by Termagants, uses borer beetles as its ammunition, which are cultivated inside the host body. These living projectiles are launched in a frenzied burst and burrow relentlessly into whatever they come into contact with, shredding flesh and light armor in their brief but savage existence. And so this type of weapon could be characterized by a common Tyranid weapon ability like Parasitic Rupture. Attacks which score wound rolls of 6 increase the AP of this weapon by 1. This also applies to lethal hits, thus describing the desperate efforts of this living ammunition. The Tyranid's Devourer might honestly be one of the most horrifying weapons in 40k. Imagine someone slingshots a wad of spaghetti at you, but that spaghetti is actually alive and wants to burrow into your body and eat your innards. Truly harrowing stuff. And so, I've characterized the Tyranid's Devourer with the ability Saturated Horror. After resolving shooting attacks for this unit, select one enemy unit hit by one or more attacks made by a weapon with this ability. That unit must take a Battle Shock test, subtracting 1 from that test for each point of damage caused by a weapon with this ability. The Devourer's strength is in its ability to sow panic against lightly armored targets, and so now it is characterized as a fear-inducing, line-breaking weapon. I think my point is clear, but admittedly, this is pretty fun. So I'll continue going, for those who enjoy this sort of thing, and for those who prefer to jump ahead, feel free to skip over to the army rules. The Death Spitter fires acid-filled maggots, so why not give it a rule like Acidic Splash? Critical hits become D3 extra hits and auto-wound, thus conveying the grenade-like splash effect such a weapon would have. Venom cannons fire toxic crystalline shards that can pierce armor and unleash corrosive venom. I think this is aptly conveyed by the ability Toxic Shards 1. If this weapon inflicts any successful wounds, after its attacks are resolved, the target suffers 1 mortal wound, which describes the 2-part action caused by the weapon. The projectile shard deals damage, and the bursting corrosive shards deal the mortal wound. For Barbed Stranglers, actually I think the Barbgaunt's ability is more suitable here than it is for the Barbgaunts, which I've just renamed to Strangling Vines. Simple but effective, though I've also restricted it from affecting flying, vehicle, and monster units. And added Ignores Cover, because I would posit the mess of barbed hooks would find gaps in cover and be able to fall into trenches. And I think that is enough to establish a kind of design paradigm. These Tyranid weapons feel much more alien relative to the conventional standard of weapons in 40k because of this. And these abilities are scalable for the larger bio-cannons, with the Hive Tyrant's Heavy Venom Cannon having something like Toxic Shards D3, and the Stranglethorn Cannon could have a modified version of Strangling Vines, to enable its effect for vehicles and monsters. And furthermore, these abilities can be applied to the larger weapon symbiotes as well. Acidic Splash works well for something like the Exocrine. And the Tyrannofex's Rupture Cannon could be better characterized by leveraging both Parasitic Rupture and Toxic Shards D3. However, this is all predicated on a design paradigm where we don't have the excessive abundance of abilities on units as we do in 10th edition, as that would make for a lot of abilities to contend with. However, if Tyranids were not forced into a paradigm where each and every unit must have an ability, it would position them differently. It may be just the setup we need for a more thematic army rule, one which offers superior characterization, which is probably as good of a segue as I'll be able to make. Fixing Synapse. So we're going to start with Synapse, which to me is the more important of the two abilities. And there are two design pillars or goals I believe are paramount when it comes to this army rule. The first, as alluded to in the critique, is that Synapse should be all about control. After all, it is trying to abstract the idea of using those synaptic conduits to override natural instincts, to direct and enable the swarm to function as a single Gestalt force. And the second design point is that Synapse should be the Tyranids' greatest strength, but also their greatest weakness. That is to say, if the enemy army begins to cause gaps in Synapse, if they remove those key Synapse creatures, it should be of major consequence to the Tyranids player. As for the rule itself, we maintain Synapse as an aura ability keyed off of the expected units, which affects all Tyranid units within 6 inches. Such units are considered to be within Synapse range, so no major changes with how this ability is structured. However, while Tyranid units are within Synapse range, they benefit from 2 perks. The first is, those units auto-pass leadership and battle shock tests, full stop. And those units increase their skill by 1, because weapon skill and ballistic skill is a better mechanical proxy for the control Synapse would confer than melee strength bonuses are, obviously. Now, this is a very beneficial army rule. And to meter this out, I would stat Tyranids with the worst standard leadership value among all the factions. Make them 11 plus leadership, with Synapse bugs and units which are supposed to be competent while outside of Synapse, such as Lictors and Genestealers, with a 7 or even 6 plus leadership characteristic. On top of this, I would give any high aggro, non-smart bug like Hormagaunts, Carnifexes, Psychophages, Instinctive Behavior, which states that if they are outside of Synapse range in the charge phase, they must declare a charge against the nearest enemy unit within 12 inches. But that is only half of the Synapse coin. The other feature I would add to Synapse would take the form of synaptic imperatives. So yeah, it is another army rule, technically, but it's one I believe is warranted as it gives that extra degree of control, and it further pushes the notion of the greatest strength being their greatest weakness. I think 9th edition had a decent structure for this system, with different Synapse bugs offering different effects, as that is often how the appearance of Synapse creatures is characterized in novels and the lore. But it needs to be opened up and made less convoluted, as many of the 9th edition army rule systems were ridiculously complex and just a mess. Like the whole having to choose one of your creatures to gain its effects on all units in Synapse range in your army, but when that one synaptic imperative is spent, you can't use it again because reasons. It's just a mess of convoluted rules upkeep. Instead, I suggest the following. Once per battle round, the following Synapse units in your army can use the imperative abilities below if it is on the battlefield. Here's the table. As you can see, it offers some pretty wild versatility. For example, if you have 2 warrior units on the battlefield, you can issue the Goaded Reformation imperative on 2 units within Synapse range to enable them to fall back and shoot and charge. Again, this system presumes we aren't in a paradigm where every unit must have their own unique ability, as we are using our Synapse units to elicit those special behaviors across the swarm, which feels to me to create a demonstrably stronger characterization for the Tyranids. But this level of control means that a full-powered swarm with all of its Synapse in place is extremely versatile and deadly, but tapers off late into the game as those Synapse creatures are slain. In theory, it should result in both players having more interesting decisions to make. The enemy player will naturally want to take out key Synapse units, which pose the greatest threat to the mission's success, or their army's strategy in particular, And the Tyranids player will need to weigh the variables. Do I keep particular Synapse units hidden to preserve their utility? Is that worth not having that unit activate in the shooting and fight phase? Should I consider keeping redundant Synapse creatures in reserves, so that the utility that they present can't simply be removed for the rest of the battle? I can't help but find the paradigm more interesting. Fundamentally, I believe with Synapse, the Tyranids should have the most unified, cohesive, and versatile coordination of any army in the setting. But without it, all of that goes out the window. Their poor leadership means that Battle Shock will be an ever-present threat. They will lack their versatile maneuverability, and enemy units will have the means to goad and corral the more aggressive bugs. And lastly, we have Shadaow In The Warp. Now in the past, the design space used for Shadaow In The Warp would impact Psychers, and the psychic tests they would make to manifest powers. That design space isn't quite available in 10th edition, but really I think we can keep it simple but more niche to evoke that older design space. Simply, psychic weapons equipped by enemy units within 12 inches of a unit with this ability gains the hazardous ability. If that weapon is already hazardous, they failed that hazardous test on a 1 or 2 instead of just 1. So there you have it, Grimdark enjoyers, another deep dive in terrible faction characterization, as well as my suggestions on how to remedy things. I think it's fair to say GW dropped the ball on the Tyranids. With a Synapse army rule that fails to convey the Hive Mind's superlative control, to a once per battle psychic scream that's pure randomness with no reliable payoff, and weapon profiles which fail to describe the bizarre, horrific abominations that Tyranid Weapon Symbiotes ought to be. But tell me what you think of the state of 10th edition Tyranids, as well as my suggested fixes. And as some of you may be aware, Northern Exile, friend of the channel, is working on his Exile edition. So tell me, would you like to see this paradigm of Tyranids fleshed out for such a rule system? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for sticking around until the end. If you enjoyed this video, there are buttons for liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thanks for watching. And a special thanks to Julius Maximus, as well as my other generous patrons and channel members. Channel members and patrons get early access to regular channel videos, as well as free access to various STL doodads. Just a little something for those who help keep the dream alive. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch ya in the next one.